Gustavo Cabral, better known as Ciruelo, is an Argentine artist of fantasy art specialized in dragons. He is currently recognized worldwide as one of the most important illustrators and referents of fantasy art or epic fantasy. He is also the creator and developer of the petropict technique, in which he draws or paints on stones without altering their original shape, finding figures in them and thus achieving a particular sculpture. Gustavo Cabral was born in Buenos Aires, Argentina, on July 20, 1963. Since he was a child, he spent the hours of his day drawing, inspired by comics, books, and movies, but his interest in fantasy art arose in his adolescence when he discovered the books of Roger Dean and Fran Frazetta, and it is at that moment, having as soundtrack the albums of Yes, one of his favorite groups at that time, that the choice of his future profession was marked. His formal artistic training began at the age of 13 at the prestigious Fernando Fader Institute in Buenos Aires, where he studied advertising design and illustration. His first drawing appeared in a school publication when he was 15, and at 16 he designed a poster for his rock band Engendro. At the age of 18, he was already working as an illustrator in an advertising agency, where he continued his apprenticeship and became familiar with the airbrush. At the age of 20, he left the agency to become a freelance illustrator, and his work began to appear in publications such as Fierro, Umi, Humor, Quiero Ser, and Playboy. In 1987, Argentina was going through a bad economic situation, so he emigrated to Spain looking for stability and to get away from the advertising field, which was the only profitable field for his profession in that country. He eventually settled in Sitges with his wife, a small town 30 kilometers from Barcelona, the same town where his compatriot Juan Jimenez lived. A year later, he travels to Barcelona, where he gets in touch with a publishing house that was beginning to publish epic fantasy by authors from the American continent, beginning to illustrate in that genre. From there, he found publishers in several countries such as England, the United States, and Germany, who provide him with fantastic and creative works. And it is not only because he was looking for this type of work out of a creative restlessness, but also because it gives him freedom in the choice of color, since surprisingly, Gustavo Cabral is colorblind. In fact, he is sometimes helped by his wife Daniela, who assists him in the choice of color for his illustrations. But far from taking that condition as a limitation, he takes advantage of it in his works. In my case, the problem helped me to achieve very well different planes, shading, and chiaroscuro. Because of my perception of color, everything is in hand. Important publishers in the United States hired him, among them Van Tam, which commissioned him to do the covers for the Chronicles of Shadow War trilogy written by George Lucas and the sequel to Willow, Ciruelo's favorite film. Other North American publishers of the same genre for which he worked were Tor Books, Warner, Valentine, Wizards of the Coast, Heavy Metal, among many others. Ciruelo created the posters for two films, Eliseo Subiela's classic Man Facing Southeast and Pablo Cesar's cult surrealist film Fuego Gris, released in 1994. The film's poster was also used to illustrate the cover of the album of the same name by the Argentine musician Luis Alberto Spinetta, which was part of the film's soundtrack. He worked for several Argentine bands as well as for the musician Steve Vai, with whom he became close friends and with whom he claims to have a very strong artistic connection. In fact, music has always been linked to his life, becoming one of his main sources of inspiration. When he works, he usually listens to Pat Metheny Group, Steve Vai, Spinetta, Seal, Lito Vitale, Jeff Beck, David Bowie, and a lot of classical music. Regarding his technique, Ciruelo mentions that his intention with realism is that the writer who is writing a book about dragons and elves has a photograph of something that cannot exist and thus help to create a more believable fantasy world. His preferred technique is based on acrylic paint, but he also uses airbrush for various details in his works. Although he has almost never worked entirely by computer, he does not consider them to be counterproductive, but rather a great help because they give him the possibility of quickly expressing ideas that traditionally would take a long time to do by any other means. He admits that he loves to experiment, and in 1985, after climbing the Andes, he took a rare stone as a gift to a Spanish friend. The fact that he wanted to write a dedication in ink on it led to a new technique he created, petrapicts, which consist of drawing animals and mythological beings on stones as sculptures. He rescues the shape of the stone and takes advantage of its natural relief, marks, and textures. In this way, he achieves a three-dimensional effect. When observed, they seem to be carved, but they are only drawings. Drawing is materializing something that until then was an abstraction. It is already an act of magic. It is to manifest something that has no form. In 1990, he spent 8 months illustrating the Great Book of the Dragon for the Spanish publisher Timos Mas. Later, this book was also published by the English publisher Paper Tiger and translated into 5 languages. Luz, The Art of Ciruelo, was published in 1997 and gathers color illustrations and several pencil drawings. In 2000, Magia, the Ciruelo sketchbook, was published with sketches, pencil, and ink drawings. These books were followed by Cuaderno de Viajes de Ciruelo, notebooks, and Fairies and Dragons. He designed the dragon for the movie George and the Dragon and created Saphira, Dragon from Aragon. Ciruelo is an artist of modern times with the spirit of an artist of past centuries, so much so that in his house he has no television or video game consoles. According to him, these devices eat up people's time, are not very stimulating, and put people in mental loops that do not generate a world of abstraction as books do. Look at what happens to those of us who are used to reading and watch a movie where we say the movie was poor. It's because our mental images were much better than the movie. You put smells, faces to that characters. That is a gift, a value to be protected. There is too much information in this fast-paced world. It sucks up your time. The day still has 24 hours. Gustavo Cabral, Ciruelo, since he was a child, knew what he wanted to do in his life, and just like his intention to turn fantasy worlds into reality, he turned what can be a children's fantasy into a reality based on study and work. He managed to become one of the best illustrators in his field, undoubtedly a true example of determination and talent.